Hi, my name is Crystal Crane, and on this topic of debunking myths, I chose to do some research on the idea of learning styles. Now, this is something that every educator has heard about. We've all heard every child has their own learning style, and we need to come up with ways to accommodate them in our classroom and not just be doing the same thing day after day. But really, what are learning styles? Let's define it. So, simply put, according to teach.com, which is a resource that I sought out, every student learns differently. That's what it means. Every student learns differently. Educational theorist Neil Fleming created something called the VARK model, VARK, of student learning. And what that involved was various types of learning, 4 types of learning to be exact: visual, which is seeing with our eyes; auditory, hearing; reading or writing; and then kinesthetic, which is tactile representation of the material. One way that we see that frequently nowadays is through STEM learning, and through those types of activities. However, this wasn't a legitimate claim. There are several articles out there. I found 3 specifically, one through Reader's Digest, Scientific American, and the Washington Post. And they basically all highlight the same thing. One of them talks, well, 2 of them actually mention how there have been several studies done. In fact, studies over the last 50 years, scientists have been looking at this idea of learning styles, and yet there's no evidence that suggests that this is a legitimate thing. In fact, what a lot of the scientists did is they had a select group of students. They had them take the VARK test, where they established what their best mode of studying was, or learning, and then they followed them over the course of a semester. And what they found is that 67% of those students, per this article by the Reader's Digest, 67% of those students actually failed to study with those things that were supposed to be their very best their best learning habits. And those that did, there really wasn't that much of a difference. The article called "The Problem with Learning Styles" suggested the same thing. And they also go on to say, perhaps the match between students' individual learning styles and their study strategies is the key. So not necessarily in this classroom, but rather how the students are studying. I thought that was really interesting. And then this same article goes on to make suggestions, which we've discussed in class, the actual best ways to do better in school. And that involves spacing out study time, experience the material in multiple modalities, test themselves, and elaborate on material to make meaningful connections. So the difference here, folks, is rote memorization. So learning style, which is supporting rote memorization, or get it in your brain quick so you can test on it and then it's out the door, versus experiential learning, or actually understanding and comprehending what it is they are learning. The third article had something really interesting I want to share. This author actually suggests that learning styles and theories might serve as an inspiration for practice, but holds no special status as such. Anything can inspire practice. The other day, and this is an article by Valerie Strauss called "The Bottom Line in Learning." That's where that was written from. The other day we were talking about the difference between intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. And it seems from these articles that the learning style, the way the material is presented, isn't necessarily what's important. It is the way that the student is connecting to the material. In fact, it seems that the idea of learning styles is honestly completely missing the point. Students' connection doesn't necessarily have to do with a learning style, but more so making a meaningful connection. I love Vygotsky's theory, the zone of proximal development. We're talking about how you have a student and they're here, but you need them to get here. And as a teacher, you need to lead them through this gray area, which is the zone of proximal development, right? And a lot of people have used the learning styles thing to say, okay, well, if you can accommodate this learning style, you can more easily get them to bridge that gap, right? Well, learning that's not necessarily what's going to facilitate that. For that student, they need to make a meaningful connection, and oftentimes that you can use background knowledge for that. So earlier this week, we talked about interests, or I'm sorry, that's next week, talking about interests, and does interest play a role in helping students learn better in the classroom? And I would argue to say that it does. If you have a student that's really interested in football and they're not interested in knitting, you're not going to use knitting examples to help them reach their end goal line, right? Maybe they understand football in such a way that it helps bridge that gap a little bit better. So, learning is more about making a meaningful connection, which also has to do with memory. And we talk about memory. We've read about that quite a bit in our book, How We Learn by Benedict. Now, this book has been a really interesting study in terms of how we learn, and I want to point out two things from this book to you. One is on page 183. And it's highlighting, there's a section about perceptual learning. That's the section that this is on. Eleanor Gibson was the primary pioneer researcher having to do with this theory. And what she says is perceptual learning is not a passive absorption, but an active process, in the sense that exploring and searching for perception itself is active. We do not just see, we look. We do not just hear, we listen. Perceptual learning is self-regulated in the sense that modification occurs without the necessity of external reinforcement. It's a stimulus oriented with the goal of extracting and reducing the information stimulation. Now, I know that was kind of a long quote, but the reason that I chose to read that is because it highlights the fact of creating an experience for the learner. It's not so much about what they hear, what they see, what they're writing. It's about the entire experience, how they are. We can't just separate and say a child learns best this way. No, they are sponges. They are learning from the entire world around them, and we need to accommodate that by creating meaningful experiences so that they can have that inner connection with their memory, but also their inner dialogue. So we talk earlier in this book, and I was flipping back to the page. We talked earlier in the book about how I believe it's the left side of the brain. They call it the story maker. That's the one that's coming up with the story, right? And there's one quote in here that says that the brain can find this thing, being a memory or whatnot, and bring it to life so fast, instantaneously. For most of us, complete with emotion and layers of detail, defies easy explanation. This is on page 15, and I believe that's chapter 1. And so this again just goes to highlight the importance of creating an experience to where we are, as educators, creating memories for our students. We're not just asking them to do rote memorization and spit out the answer and then forget about it 20 minutes later. We're asking them to create meaningful experiences, connect to the past, to bridge the gap to the future learning, and we're constantly scaffolding and building on that, and building, because that is what each grade is essentially doing anyways, building on the one before. So in conclusion, debunking myths, the myth of learning styles, we cannot just simply say that a student has one specific learning style. That's not really fair to the student. We need to be, as educators, creating a more holistic approach to learning and creating an environment that induces personal experiences, memories, connecting to background information, and bridging the gap.